here. Okay. Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Geocase Forum, a new webinar series that brings together leading voices to explore the forces, ideas, and people driving social and political transformations in an age of global disorder. This series is a co-production of the think tank Geocase and the London-based public relations agency Topouria Group. My name is Victor Topouria. I'm one of the founding partners of SET PR agency, as well as the international communications manager for Geocase. It is my great privilege to be moderating today's conversation about how post-authoritarian societies can overcome political and cultural inertia and find real democratic agency in the world. Specifically, we're going to examine the issue within the context of three distinct cases. These are Hungary, Armenia, and Georgia. Joining me today is a distinguished panel of journalists, analysts, and practitioners who bring to this conversation intimate knowledge of the countries and issues we will be discussing. These are Julius Strauss, a veteran journalist who spent 15 years as a war and foreign correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, including 3 years as the paper's Moscow correspondent in the early mid-2000s. Julius has covered conflicts across the post-Soviet and post-communist countries of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, the Balkans, as well as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most recently, he was on the ground in Budapest reporting on the Hungarian elections for his Substack publication, Back from the Front, which I highly recommend everyone subscribe to. And if his journalistic career was not impressive enough, Julius is also the owner of the Wild Bear Lodge, a grizzly bear viewing retreat in British Columbia, Canada, which is where he's joining us from now. So thank you for being here, Julius. Um, Coming to us from Yerevan is Armen Sahakyan, a policy advisor and civic engagement advocate who serves as the Armenia country director for the Armenian Assembly of America, the largest Armenian advocacy organization in the United States. He's a specialist in international political economy and brings over a decade of experience at the intersection of diplomacy, policy, and civic empowerment, both in the US and Armenia. He is coming up participating in this week's Yerevan dialogue, so we're grateful for his presence after a long week. Last but certainly not least, we are joined by Victor Kipiani from Tbilisi. Victor is the chairman of Geocase, where he leads a team of researchers and analysts providing independent analysis on international relations, security, governance, and Georgia's place in the shifting global order. He's also the founder of the Jer Sakartvelo movement, or Georgia First in English. It is a non-party political initiative working to engage Georgian citizens in building a new vision for the country's democratic future. Victor is a frequent commentator in both Georgian and international media on geopolitics and political developments in the Caucasus and the wider region. He's also a lawyer by profession and a senior partner at MKD Law, one of Georgia's leading legal practices. I will take this opportunity to say it's a great pleasure to work with Victor regularly, and I'm grateful for his support and partnership in bringing this webinar series to life. With all that being said, gentlemen, thanks again for being here, and I hope we have a stimulating discussion ahead. The world that we see unfolding in front of us right now, it seems the post-Cold War order has broken down and a new one is yet to emerge. In this vacuum, post-Soviet and post-totalitarian inertia persists, but it takes different character in each country. And without sounding too abstract, I want to clarify that inertia in this context, I mean, as a state of being stuck in an old pattern of behavior, in old structures, of being unable to escape from them, even when you are confronted by a reality that makes clear those behaviors are counterproductive at best and self-destructive at their worst. The countries that are subject of today's discussions are at three different stages of overcoming this inertia. Hungary has just voted out Viktor Orban in the most significant election in Central Europe since 1989. With Péter Magyar's victory, the Hungarian people reclaimed their country after 16 years of Orban's rule that saw systemic efforts to dismantle democratic institutions and aligning the country closer to Russia. Armenia, under the leadership of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, is in the process of consolidating a real peace after 35 years of war with neighboring Azerbaijan. This week's historical European summits in Yerevan are signals that Armenia is breaking free of its past dependencies and asserting its democratic agency and engaging meaningfully with the West. Meanwhile, in Georgia, we have a very different situation. Once a model republic for what a post-Soviet democracy could be and an anchor for Western engagement in the region, it has regressed back toward authoritarian practices and Russian influence under Bidzina Ivanishvili's Georgia Dream Party. Today, it looks less like a genuine independent state with its own agency and more like a passive geography, a sphere of influence, a gray zone, a buffer. So my question to all three of you is that based on your unique vantage points of these countries where you live and work, what does political inertia look like from the inside? And where do these countries find themselves today at this junction? And we'll start with Julius on Hungary.
I mean, Hungary's in a bit of a mess at the moment because we've had 16 years of Viktor Orban. And whatever you thought of Viktor Orban politically, or whether you sympathize with his values or not, he has slowly run the economy down and down and down. Partly that was inefficiency, partly that was corruption, and partly that was just, something, I don't know what to call it, something worse than corruption, just sort of outright stealing. There was a lot of, we're talking about billions of dollars that were taken out of the Hungarian economy and put into various pet projects or into people's pockets. So it's a form of corruption, but it's quite an extreme form of corruption by European standards. So, what we've got now, we've got a very high national debt. We've got the highest cumulative inflation in Europe over the last 5 years. And you only have to drive around Hungary, go into a state hospital or a school, or use the railway network to realize that the infrastructure of the country is crumbling. And that very, very shortly is why Orban lost power. It's not so much because of geopolitical things, although that has some influence. Now, all that said, we've got a chance. We've got a new chance in Hungary. Sometimes I say we, sometimes I say they. I'm a Hungarian citizen. I speak Hungarian, but I mostly live in Canada and the UK. So forgive me if I'm inconsistent on that. But, we Hungarians, we have a chance at some kind of new beginning. Most people voted for Peter Magyar, not because they thought that he was the sort of, the savior that was going to bring a completely new era, but because they'd had enough of Orban. And Orban has gone. The transition is happening probably more quickly than anybody could have expected. So that gives some hope and a chance for something different. And so there's hope in Hungary. There's optimism.
Armen, could you say a few words on Armenia, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to Geocase and to you, Victor, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be among such distinguished fellow panelists. And also a quick disclaimer that whatever I share is largely my personal views and not necessarily reflective of the organization that I represent. But nevertheless, I think in Armenia, it's been nothing but inertia in the last, I would say, 8 years. Starting in 2018, when the country went through what's known as the Velvet Revolution, the other Velvet Revolution outside of Hungary earlier. And that sort of brought about newfound hopes and aspirations of the citizens of this country for a more democratic, prosperous future for themselves. Only, of course, to be, in many ways challenged by COVID, the 2020 war, 44-day war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, and then the subsequent developments that have taken place leading up to the August 8th, 2025 peace summit hosted by President Trump in Washington, D.C., where Armenia and Azerbaijan initialed the peace agreement witnessed by the President of the United States and signed a whole host of other bilateral treaties or MOUs with the United States. So that's been sort of the most seminal, latest point in the development of Armenia. And now we're literally 1 month away from very consequential elections in the country to take place on June 7th. Today, in fact, the official campaign started. So all the political parties and factions, and there's 19 of them in this race, are out to try and get the citizens to vote in their favor. So in many respects, the choice, to put it very crudely, put in front of the citizens of Armenia is, are you choosing this newfound westward pivot of Armenia, or is Armenia going to be sort of going back into its so-called traditional orbit of being a staunch Russian ally and a member of all the organizations that come with it, including the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union, and such. So Armenia, to put it in one sentence, perhaps finds itself at the cusp of either breaking sort of away from this inertia and consolidating its more westward development trajectory, or sort of going back to what it was known for even pre-2020.
Thank you, Armen. Victor?
Yes, obviously, we've stopped usual practices for the which we've been practicing for the last decade, and that practice could be encapsulated in saying in this way, punching above our weight. We've stopped punching above our weight, which is so important, especially for a small nation in this volatile world, and for the nation which is the prisoner of geography. That's another implication for our domestic and foreign politics. Another point of concern that the semblance of Soviet Union, or let's say, Georgia's Soviet Socialist Republic, has been quite successfully reconstructed. And I have to admit that quite significant chunk of Georgian population bought in. And alongside with demolishing traditional pillars of functional state, its rule of law, institutions, we began sliding into the geography. Just having a different color on the world map. Unfortunately, that's the reality. Very much regrettable and very much shameful also, I have to admit, but that's where we are. On our side, however, an upside or upsides that looks like that regardless of all that, all those negatives, looks like that people are realizing that if you speak about democracy, if you speak about normalcy, let's put in this way, normalcy, not democracy, the process should be from the bottom to the up. And if there's some lessons which hopefully would be learned from the process, that people becoming co-owners of their own country and not waiting for some godfather or some sort of outsourcing destiny on someone's shoulders. And the last but not the least, I mentioned the prison of geography, and looks like that we, alongside with getting back to the normalcy, or after we acquired that normalcy, we should also be learning, avoiding falling into extremes and black and white. When we speak about foreign policy, and I think it should be more about the masterpiece of hedging. Different connotations, multi-vector policy, multipole, etc., etc. That does not matter for me as much as I keep saying that there's a principle of the checks and balances in the constitutional law. So I would rather favor the same principle of checks and balances in geopolitics and geoeconomy when it relates to such volatile countries Georgia is. So this is in very brief, and thank you again. Victor, thank you again. I was supposed to say that at the very beginning for all your efforts to put out this.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for your remarks. I think punching above their weights is probably something that you can say about Hungary, Armenia, and Georgia at this point or in previous points in history, but they are, of course, tiny countries relative to the bigger geopolitical picture. So I'd like to zoom out for a minute and kind of look at the wider geopolitical trends that are happening around the region and the key players. And I think a natural place to start, just given the summits in Yerevan, is Europe and the European Union. Obviously, Peter Magyar assumes the prime ministership this weekend. We saw the summit in Yerevan this week, which is historic, first ever on Caucasus soil. We see the EU planning to deploy a task force to combat disinformation in Armenia ahead of the June elections. And all those visions that were outlined in places like Davos and Munich at the beginning of the year about Europe asserting its position as a geopolitical power, about this middle power cooperation, they seem to be taking shape, and Europe seems to be more confident. And as Julius said, there is actual hope in Hungary. But at the same time, if you look at other countries across the EU, you're seeing rising polarization, eroding institutional trust, more extremist parties gaining ground. I mean, just in the UK today, we saw Reform UK, the Nigel Farage's party, gain extraordinary amount of seats across various councils. So as much as there is hope, are we seeing really the first signs of Europe arriving as a geopolitical actor, or is this kind of a euphoric period that's going to be followed by hard tests and internal contradictions? And I'm going to give this question to you, Julius, if that's okay.
I mean, I think we've got countervailing things going on here. On the one side, Trump's America is not looking particularly adept. Let's be polite about it. the mess in the Middle East, the war in Iran, and lots of other geopolitical adventurism is not making America look particularly good. And also the American economy is showing signs of difficulty. And again, I'm being, relatively polite. On the other side, Russia has had a lot of setbacks. I think we're going to talk a little bit about Russia in a minute, so I won't go into that right now. So Europe is looking relatively good because some of the other centers of power are looking weaker, more chaotic. Their systems are coming under question. So Europe, has not sort of sunk in the way that other people have. But there's a danger here in saying that is because Europe is getting better. I think it's more a question of needs must, and needs must is creating some desirable outcomes. There is more of a sense of unity in Europe, perhaps, mostly because of the Russia threat and because Trump is threatening to sort of leave them on their own, particularly in security terms. But on the other side, as you say, there's rising populism everywhere. The results in Britain you just mentioned. Populist parties are doing very well throughout Europe. We've got the AfD, we've got the situation in France with the far right, we've got Meloni in Italy. Eastern Europe is, we've got Fico in Slovakia, we've got Babiš in Czech, we've got Vučić in Serbia. So these are not isolated phenomena, the rise in populism. And the rise in populism has reasons too. It's not just because the EU is not good at communicating or, we haven't sold the political narrative properly. There are genuine reasons why Hungarians and Serbs and Slovaks are a bit fed up. 30 years after the fall of communism, they were expecting more than that. And again, we could go down that rabbit hole as to exactly why. But sometimes there's a liberal tendency, and I count myself as a liberal, but there's a liberal tendency to say, well, the people are mistaken. They've got it all wrong. No, it's not. There's lots of things that went wrong in places like Hungary. And if you live in the Hungarian countryside, there were reasons to vote for Orban. At least there were 15 years ago, perhaps not in this election, 16 years ago. So we've got these different things going on, and it's a pretty chaotic period. We'll have to see how it works out. 1 minute you think, oh, finally, Europe has got its act together. It's talking about some form of coordinated rearmament. It's talking about strengthening its position within NATO. And then you see a spat between the French and the Germans over how exactly are we going to rearm? Are we going to rely on the US or not? And just picking up one point here, I think in a way, if Trump was unambiguously anti-European and always anti-European, it would be a little bit easier in a way because Europe would be forced to take some very, very difficult steps. But Trump goes back and forwards on Europe, and it gives those people who say, you know what, the US is not that bad. Let's just wait until Trump is gone and things will go back to where they were. We don't really have to replace all the American military capabilities in NATO, for example, because eventually at the end of the day, they will still help us. It gives that argument some credence that it doesn't necessarily have. So we've got all these different things going on, all these different tendencies, all these different streams of developments, and it's very, very difficult to predict how it's gonna come out. So yeah, just to reiterate, I think Europe looks good because the US and Russia are not doing particularly well, rather than because it's got a lot of sort of inherent new strength within it. But let's hope for the best.
Right. And these vacillations, I mean, it is a double-edged sword. So, Armen, being in Yerevan this week and seeing EU engagement in the region, and then thinking about that there are still these internal contradictions with the European-US relationship and in EU countries themselves. Does it feel like this is a genuine engagement, or do you think that it's mostly symbolism and that this is something that could be kind of pulled out under you at some point? I mean, I don't know if it's the best comparison to compare Georgia-European relations prior to 2008 as an example, but there is a track record here of overpromising and under-delivering. So do you think this moment is generally different as it comes to Armenia?
Right. I would say being in Yerevan, this was pretty much an unprecedented event that took place over the last week. Armenia hosted the 8th European Political Community Summit, as well as the first Armenia-EU summit that they obviously made coincide. The French president was here on a state visit. So this was the largest convergence of all the European leaders this country has ever seen. Of course, a lot of people view it also in the context of the upcoming elections, with the current government being sort of, endorsed, at least tacitly, by the European leaders. Similarly, when Vice President Vance was in town earlier in February, he very outwardly shared his sentiments regarding the current prime minister and the ruling party. But in many respects, the partnership between Armenia and European Union, I would say, is very much genuine. It's grounded in realities on the ground. The European Union has a civilian monitoring observer mission stationed in this country for the last 2 years, who have been monitoring the border. They are not armed, so just with, as often the saying goes, with binoculars and cameras, the border along Armenia and Azerbaijan, which has had genuine, real impact on the ground. They have been able to play their role in maintaining relative stability that has, in many ways, you could argue, led to the signing of the initial link of the peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's also, of course, the private sector partnership. Armenia and EU are currently in the process of negotiating on the visa liberalization for Armenian citizens and passport holders to be able to travel without a visa to the Schengen zone for tourist purposes. Of course, Georgia has had this for over 10 years at this point, although that's been eroding a little bit with, certain categories of people. And I got to say that the partnership of Georgia with the EU and the United States and Canada, in many respects, was an inspiration and a blueprint for Armenian Armenians. So for the longest time, Georgia sort of served as this beacon of hope and as an example of what is possible. Because as you can imagine, of course, the counter narrative and the propaganda is saying that, as the Belarusian president told to Armenia and Armenians, where are you going to go? Where are you going to run away? Like, you have nowhere else to go. You're cornered, essentially. And so I think in many respects, obviously there's the symbolic component of the European leaders coming to show support for the country, but there's also a lot of very strategic partnerships and programs across the development program. Security, EU is providing non-lethal assistance to Armenia through the European Peace Facility. I'm probably missing a good chunk of all the levels of partnership between the two countries or the two parties. Obviously, the hope is that this will be sustained, and it will take to both sides. It will take the Armenian government, whichever one it is, after June 7th elections, as well as Brussels and member states, to continue this momentum. We don't take it for granted. We shouldn't take it for granted, but rather do the work in front of us and hope for the best.
Right. And Victor, you were there as well, observing this historic moment and watching this engagement. As a Georgian, it must be a bittersweet experience. You were there, not as, of course, not as representing the Georgian government, but representing your political initiative, Georgia First, and you had some high-level meetings with counterparts from the Belarusian opposition, as well as from Latvian government, French government. Can you tell us the feedback you got from European counterparts about where Georgia is now, and also about what you're building with Georgia First? What were your takeaways?
When we speak about EU and Georgia, EU and South Caucasus and Armenia, I think it's always a two-way street. From Georgia's perspective, to start with, it's very symbolical that EU is here. And they have demonstrated their footprint in the South Caucasus. And for, again, to be very much direct and very much honest, for Georgia's domestic politics, that's very important. That demonstration is really very important because it has uplifted certain sentiments here on the ground. And it also means that EU and for Georgia, it's not just about investments, potential investments or potential security umbrella, but it also means that, to step aside a little bit, the war in Ukraine would one day end up with some political compromise. Before that happens, it's really very important for Georgia and Armenia at that moment to be on the right side of a new Iron Cat. because what is obvious to me, there would not be any harmony as a result of ending the war in Ukraine. There would be no balance, no new divide between some normative camps. So it's really very important for us to be on the right side. And when I speak about temptations of some gentlemen here on the ground to sort of, to push us to the wrong side of the new dividing line, that summit was a clear demonstration that EU is here. But it's when I mentioned about two-way street, Victor, not just about us or Armenia being sort of, the consumers. Probably it's wrong word, but it's also about European Union to find a new role, new niche, a new assertive role, and find South Caucasus and the cooperation with Armenia and Georgia as a unique opportunity for rebirth, geopolitical and geoeconomical, especially while witnessing how complex relations are between the United States and EU and then all the competing and rivalries, not just between those two, but globally. You need fresh blood. And I was keep saying that Ukraine, in its own way, and Georgia and Armenia could be that inflow of fresh blood to some stalemate, which EU has been experiencing for many years already, and we have to speak as a partners. We have to speak openly about that. So again, it's a two-way street. It has very special meaning for Armenia, definitely, but it has even more special meaning for Georgia. And last but not least, and what is important, and I'm very grateful to my Armenian contacts, how much they appreciate that if we team up with Armenia teams up with Georgia, provided that we're back to the right track, that would be of an added value to respective national efforts, and that would be more enticing and more stimulating for EU as well. So that is another very important lesson, and I very much hope that at some point, rather sooner than later, we would be in the same, geopolitical portfolio. Thank you.
Yeah, the EU offers hope for Armenia and Georgia, and in exchange, as you said, the region offers a new kind of energy, a revitalization, perhaps, and a solidification of it as a geopolitical actor. But then this obviously comes at the expense of the traditional hegemon of the region. And I'd like to switch and talk about Russia. Russia here. Julius, you covered Russia in the early 2000s when Putin was consolidating his power. Now all signs point to the decline in Russian influence. We're seeing Ukraine conduct very impressive counteroffensives, drone counteroffensives across Russian territory. Russia has lost key allies across the world, including Syria and Venezuela. Tehran is under fire by Trump, the US and Israel. Hungary has flipped. Azerbaijan relationship has soured. Armenia is slipping away. And now this week, there were reports that Putin has hunkering down in a bunker for fear of assassination. And meanwhile, we're watching President Macron jog around Yerevan and take selfies with Pashinyan. So it's an interesting moment, and it's one that I didn't think would come this early. I don't know if I should be optimistic, but what do you expect from Russia at this junction, where it appears to be weakening but not yet broken? What can we expect from this sort of desperate and dangerous Russia?
Yeah, I mean, predicting anything in Russia is a fool's game, because things, what's the old saying? Things happen slowly and then they happen quickly. I mean, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of points, I was in Baku a couple of months ago, and I was surprised at the breakdown, or how far the breakdown between Azerbaijan and Russia had gone. You've talked about Iran. You guys are experts in the South Caucasus, so I'm not going to talk about the South Caucasus. But, the fall of Hungary, or the fall of Orban's Hungary from the Russian perspective, is a really, really big deal. Hungary was, in terms of process, Hungary was a Russian ally within the EU that was blocking a lot of things that Russia didn't like. But in terms of logistics, it was also a very, very important, and to a certain extent still is, a very important logistical hub for hybrid warfare against Western Europe. I mean, I spoke to somebody in the Hungarian government who told me they estimate there are 2,000 to 3,000 illegals, Russian illegals, working in Hungary right now. So that's spies who are not registered at the embassy in some form of capacity. Now, even if that's an overestimate, which it might be, you get a sense of the idea. And these people they were within Schengen, so they could pretty much travel around Europe and do whatever they wanted to do from a fairly safe base in Hungary. Now that is beginning to change. And we've just seen one significant expulsion from the new government, and that will hopefully continue to change. But looking at it from the big kind of Russian perspective, things are not going well. And then let's look at Russia itself. We've got the problems with the internet outages. Initially they were saying, well, we're just taking the SIM cards offline so the Ukrainians can't use them for their drones. Well, it's turned into something much, much bigger than that. We've got, people like Levada registering a fall in support of Putin. I was in Ukraine, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks ago. I was in Kharkiv and Kiev and Odessa, and there's a new confidence in Ukraine. Now, I want to specify here a little bit. It's not that the Ukrainians think that they're about to launch a big counteroffensive and regain a lot of land. It's that they're fairly confident that they can freeze the front line where it is. There are variables, and that confidence may turn out to be misplaced. But it's quite a lot to do with technology, and it's not just about sort of Ukrainian resilience, although Ukrainian resilience is remarkable. But it's basically to do with drones. So there's a big, big gap between the Ukrainians being able to stop the Russians advancing and the Ukrainians being able to advance in the other direction. Because as soon as the Ukrainians start to advance, they're going to run into the same problems that the Russians are now running into on the battlefield. Nevertheless, Putin's big gamble, which is that I am going to take at least eastern Ukraine and preferably the whole of Ukraine, or have control of the whole of Ukraine, or whatever we think that was, and we have a pretty good idea what that was, is not paying off. And the Russian people at home are sitting there and they're going, this is not looking very good anymore. So what happens next? Well, I've always thought, going back to 2022, since the beginning of the full-scale war, I've thought that there's going to be a moment of considerably higher peril than we were in at that particular time. And that moment of high peril has not come yet. So as we approach a point where Putin feels that his life is in danger, or his freedom is in danger, or his position is in danger, knowing what we know 2 things about Putin. And again, there's a bit of countervailing tendencies here. One is that he tends to be cautious and he procrastinates and he thinks things through very carefully. But the other is that he doubles down. The tendency, I think, will be for him to double down, however long it takes him to get to that position. And at that point, things could get dangerous and there could be something unexpected. From his position, what could he do to double down? He could increase attacks on Western Europe. It could be something hybrid. It could potentially be a move against the Baltics. And it doesn't have to be, an invasion of Europe. Perhaps he sends tanks 500 meters into Estonia, or even just special forces. And then he sits there and he waits and he watches Europe's reaction, watches the US reaction. And if things really go badly for him, he can retreat. If things go well, he can push a little bit further, and so on and so on. So we could get into a different game. And the French and the Germans particularly think that probably not this year, but perhaps next year, things are going to get significantly more dangerous in terms of the sort of evolving hybrid stroke kinetic war with Russia.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the reaction that might follow. But in Georgia right now, obviously the Russian network of influence is already quite entrenched. Could you discuss how exactly these Russian influence networks work? How does Russian shadow money flow through the economy? How does the Georgian economy help Russia in sanctions evasions, which is something that we've been hearing a lot about recently? I know it's a complicated questions, but if you can briefly cover that, that would be very helpful.
Yes, it is complicated, and really not to speculate because there's I mean, no one has seen a smoking gun, frankly speaking, how much the Georgian the ruling party has plugged in the Georgian into the Russian system. So I would rather avoid any sort of allegations. But there are some, of course, and the saying that GD is a proxy, so forth, so on. I think GD is not pro-Russian. GD is not pro. GD is just pro-GD. GD is the Georgian dream. GD is just pro-power and pro-resourcefulness. That what GD stands for. If they wish to change cults tomorrow, they would do it very readily. On another side, however, I mentioned that I promised not to speculate. However, there are some indicators, and those indicators is a certain playbook in Georgian domestic politics, and I'm I very much suspect, that that playbook is not something which GD is sort of capable to do without any advice or some guidance from outside. That's one point. Another point you mentioned, you mentioned the economy, and well, for example, Georgia is not an oil-producing country, but it has increased its oil exports over the last period of time tremendously, which rings a bell, or the Russian deposits, which has skyrocketed in Georgian banks, so that's also quite an ominous sign, if you ask me. And then on top of that, Georgian security services, which is practically non-existent. How much people come from Russia or from anywhere else to Georgia? There is no scrutiny, there's no screening, and the concern that there could be some dormant cells here that could be activated on a need basis. Have we pursued the policies of a standoff with Russia? Yes and no, and I'll explain what I mean. So I'm very much in favor of compartmentalizing relations with Russia, which means that we have to speak with them on issues we have to speak on. We have to dispute on those issues which are disputable, and other issues which are not negotiable at this point because we simply cannot sort them out. It's about sovereignty. It's about pulling out Russian troops from Georgia. We have to wait for a better geopolitical moment. So that what I mean, a different track approach could be more sensible for us, and that is very unpopular statement for many Georgians, but I think that's very much to the new level or new maturity of Georgian geopolitical game, which we have to pursue if we want to be a competitive nation in decades to come.
This interrelation between the exterior geopolitical dynamics and the need for external support, but also the main bread and butter is getting the people on the ground to start thinking differently and mobilizing people to change. And Armen, in Armenia right now, it's obviously coming off very deep wounds from the loss of Karabakh. And obviously, as much as people are optimistic and are on board with this Western trajectory, and they are hopeful, the wounds remain very raw, and it's a key point of contention in these elections. And from where Armenia stands right now, what is the tension between this geopolitical moment versus Armenians' domestic predispositions and domestic agency, and to which side is influencing the political landscape more ahead of the elections?
Obviously, a bit of a complicated question, but just to try to better explain to our listeners and viewers, the 44-day war in 2020 between Armenia and Azerbaijan ended with Armenian side's defeat, with some part of Nagorno-Karabakh at the time remaining de facto, with Russian peacekeeping troops being stationed there ever since, with an initial mandate of 5 years to be renewed for a specific period with the agreement of both parties, that being Armenia and Azerbaijan. And what we witnessed not even 5 years past, so in 2023, was the mass exodus and ethnic cleansing of Armenians. Over 120,000 people ended up leaving virtually overnight the territory of the de facto country. The de facto president signed the decree to abolish the republic itself. And so Armenia suddenly overnight sort of found itself with the inflow of compatriots, Armenians largely, into the country. So there was this initial humanitarian challenge that was related to housing and food and shelter and things of the sort. And the international community did come around on that a little bit, especially the Europeans, and a little bit on the American side as well. And then ever since, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, the refugee population, some of them took Armenian citizenship as well, has been sort of used in many respects or abused as a subject of political discourse and gambling in the country. One thing to note is that this population obviously is not a monolith. They have their own, everybody has their own political views and ideologies, despite what may be presented that they all would be, for example, anti-current government or something else. Never mind the fact that 100,000 in over 2 million voting eligible population is not necessarily going to be a major swing, even if we presumed, right, that everybody was going to vote the same way. But nevertheless, this topic is part of the campaign. Certain political parties and groups running are promising the population that they would be able to go back to Nagorno-Karabakh. This idea of collective right to return. And this is being faced back very sternly by the ruling party, saying that they, under the leadership of the prime minister, are essentially stopping the Karabakh movement, which was the movement that started in the 80s in its latest iteration to have a self-determination movement for the Armenians in that part of the world. So in many respects, the election is also going to be a bit of a referendum on this. Are Armenians, sort of as citizens of this country, going to sort of put it very crudely, put it kind of past them and move forward with the peace agenda and the peace process with Azerbaijan? Or, are there going to be certain still ideas that, certain aspects of the movement would be moving forward? This is also, of course, within the context of still 19 Armenians being held as POWs and hostages in Baku by the government of Azerbaijan. So that's also a very sore subject, and one also part of the current elections. So it's a very sort of volatile, complicated situation. And yeah, there have been some calls from civil society essentially not to sort of to have ethical boundaries and lines, and not necessarily sort of use this trauma that especially the refugees have gone through, but broadly Armenians here and worldwide in the diaspora, and make it part of the campaign, but rather sort of focus on other issues, as well. And one other thing I really quickly wanted to note as well is the item related to just the peace process overall. Of course, there's the hostages issue, but there's also the issue of constitutional changes in Armenia that Azerbaijan is sort of putting as a precondition to signing. So it's just like a multi-step, three-dimensional chess sort of situation. And so it's very hard to just pinpoint one or two factors. It's just going to be bundle deal, essentially, that the voters have to go and cast their votes. So we'll see how it plays out. We're less than a month out at this point.
Right. Thank you. And every one of those themes that you mentioned deserves a deep dive of its own. Unfortunately, the challenge of talking about three complicated countries, domestic and foreign politics in 1 hour, is almost impossible. So, but I'd like to pivot a little bit, because I want to get to a meaty part of discussion that involves actually mobilizing people on the ground. And I want to come back to Julius and talk about the kind of tactical playbook that people talk about that led to Magyar's victory. That victory was a huge inspiration in the Georgian opposition circles, and people talk about copying this playbook and who's the next Magyar and all these things. So as somebody who spent all this time on the ground in Budapest and observing the election campaigns, are there any lessons? Are there things that you observed? Like, obviously in the beginning you mentioned that simply it was people were fed up, falling living standards, corruption. But in terms of what the Tisa and Magyar did, what were the deciding factors there?
I mean, I think first of all, the obvious thing, the state was rotten. And by the end, pretty much everybody could see that. There was some disagreement perhaps on whose fault it was, but everybody could see that. So, I mean, the intervention, like J.D. Vance went to Budapest in the days running up to the election. Donald Trump gave a telephone endorsement. These things didn't matter at all to Hungarians. They didn't care about that kind of stuff. It might have mattered to Orban, maybe personally, but not to Hungarian voters. So Magyar came at a sort of fortuitous time politically when people were really beginning to say, this is not working out at all. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse. At a kind of internal level, as we mentioned, the infrastructure was crumbling. There was corruption everywhere. People were feeling poor. At an international level, Hungarians were looking at the relationship with Moscow and saying, really, do we really have to go back into that sort of power dynamic with Russia again? There were a few who said yes, but mostly they said no. And then Magyar came along and he did some clever things. The first thing he did is he started working a lot in the countryside. He went on this very well publicized walk. I forget now if it was 20 days or 22 days or whatever. But he basically walked from Budapest to the border. He talked to lots of villagers. And so he got this air of somebody who cares about the state of normal Hungarians in the countryside, which is always a very difficult thing to achieve for a liberal Hungarian, or I wouldn't call Magyar a liberal, but a Hungarian from Budapest who is very well educated and who's very metropolitan. And often it's those people who, the people in the countryside look at them and they say, they don't represent me. They're not me. They're from a different place. So Magyar very much tried to bridge that gap. The second thing he did is that he absolutely meticulously avoided these wedge issues in Hungary. One of them is the whole sort of social values thing, LGBT rights in the public sphere, different levels of, if you want to be right-wing, you'd call them wokeness. If you wanted to be left-wing, you'd call them progressive things. He just stayed off those topics altogether. So last summer, there was a big pride parade in Budapest. And this really put Magyar on the spot because he didn't want to alienate conservative voters, but nor did he want to irritate liberal voters. So he simply stayed away. And he said, oh, sorry, I've pre-booked a holiday on these particular dates. I'm flying out tomorrow. What a shame. I won't be here. So, that was the thing he did with sort of LGBT and social values. And then the other big one is Ukraine. I mean, we could talk about Hungary and Ukraine forever. It's a complex relationship. But under this kind of overwhelming state propaganda from Orban that had been going on for many, many, many years, a lot of Hungarians were very anti-Ukrainian. There are some historical reasons too, but mostly it was to do with this sort of state propaganda, to the extent that Orban voters had 5% of them had a positive view of Zelensky, and 55% of them had a positive view of Putin. So it was very, very significant, the reach of this sort of state propaganda. And Magyar realized that by talking about Ukraine, he wasn't going to win over any liberals. They were going to vote for him anyway, but he may lose some of the more patriotic, perhaps nationalist voters. So again, he just stayed off Ukraine altogether. And then I think the other thing, a lot of modern leaders, he's very good at social media. He's sort of young, he's in his 40s. He looks kind of energetic and, he looks like he's got ideas, he's going somewhere, and he had a very good social media campaign. Now, it's worth mentioning a couple of things here. The first thing is that some of the conservative reaction in Western Europe has been to Magyar's victory, has been, well, that just shows that Orban wasn't really an autocrat. That is nonsense. Orban tried, well, whether he's an autocrat or not, we can argue about the terminology, but he tried to fix the elections. It wasn't that he just said, oh yeah, let's have some democratic elections and see how I do. I've heard some of the right-wing media say that the Hungarian elections were free and fair. They were not free and fair. They were heavily stacked in Fidesz's favor. But in the end, the amount of disappointment with Orban and the resentment within the Hungarian people was just too big. So when the election results came in on the night, there were still all kinds of scenarios where some of them the Russians were involved in, some of them they weren't, but there were all kinds of scenarios for subverting the national will. But they looked at Fidesz looked at the initial results coming in from the countryside, places they should have won handily, and they saw this enormous, significant Magyar advantage, and then they put their hands up and they said, you know what, whatever we do next, even if we throw everything we've got at it, we cannot change this result. And if we try and fail, then we're all going to prison in very short order. So it wasn't, it wasn't a sort of let's roll the dice and see how we do with the people. It was that they didn't have the capability. And I'm just going to take this. I know, I'm talking for a bit here, but I want to take this one step further because I think this is really important. There's a difference between what you have in Russia and what you have in Belarus and what you had in Hungary. What you had in Russia and Belarus, they have very strong, heavy-handed ability to send in guys with truncheons or guns or whatever it happens to be. They have a very strong security force. Hungary did not have that. Hungary had a divided secret service. It had a conflicted military that there was no way they were going to go and shoot people on the streets. And it had a really annoyed and disillusioned police force. They had 2,500 kind of Orban, fairly loyal Orban heavies, which is an organization called TEC. It's like a counterterrorism force. But even they weren't completely homogenous, and 2,500 people is not enough to put down a country that is protesting. And the reason I think this is so significant at a kind of a global level or a wider level is that in that sense, what Trump is trying to do in the US is similar to what Orban was trying to do in Hungary. In other words, he was trying to take a country down a relatively authoritarian path, get rid of some of the democratic checks and balances, but doing it purely on with informational tools, but without the real kind of heavy, brutal suppression abilities that people like Putin have. And that system failed. It didn't fail in the first decade. It lasted for 16 years. But ultimately, when the Hungarian people turned around and said, we've had enough of this, Orban didn't have the tools or the desire or the conviction or whatever it was to try and crush that popular will. And I think that has really discredited this kind of soft authoritarian model. When things go wrong, you either have the heavies or you don't. And Orban didn't have them.
Victor, I'd like to hand it back to you. Given what Julius just said, and obviously Hungary is not Georgia, and you reiterated that it's not the same situation. The structural circumstances are different, and the legacies are different, although similar. But beneath the geopolitics and the electoral strategies, if we may get down to a little deeper on the maybe a psychological level, cultural level, and you've discussed this phenomenon quite often. It's the phenomenon of Homo Sovieticus, is the legacy that is left behind by Soviet totalitarian rule, which includes political passivity, a distrust in institutions, learned helplessness that people who survive these regimes kind of keep their heads down and expect nothing from the state. But this doesn't disappear with a change of government. It has to be unlearned over time. So I'm just curious, how, as somebody who is leading a grassroots initiative in Georgia, how do you overcome the inertia of Homo Sovieticus with ideas, new initiatives, and also maybe a little bit about what you take away from Hungary and what you think is best left to Hungary, and maybe some things are best done from scratch in Georgia? Just curious about how you view those things.
We do what we could, but we don't have a recipe, frankly, how to which we would be able successfully to overcome that challenge. You mentioned the Homo Sovieticus. I think, when we're pointing out personalities, I think that we have to take our own share of the blame and the share that is, if not that fertile ground of societal acceptance of that what we see on the radars, that would not crystallize. That's for sure. So I mean that the deep cause of the grievances which we're facing more of it's not even philosophical, but nevertheless more profound than just personality stuff. Personalities are just byproducts. What's happening around us and what we're creating on our own. So that is sort of a brief introduction. Another side on Magyar's the experience. Yeah, I'm always resisting that sort of a copy-pasting approach. Several times I've been asked on Georgian media, who is a Georgian Magyar? Again, this infancy of political thinking that really very much amazing. Of course, we have to learn lessons, but looking or waiting for some geopolitical babysitter, some miracle or the black swan to fly in, and we're just waiting and looking into the windows. That's so naive. It does not sound. It does not portray us getting to the next level of maturity and in our political philosophy. Nevertheless, a few lessons which have to be learned from the Hungarian experience. First of all, the Magyar has institutionalized the elections and institutionalized the institutions. And that being said, I'm very much against of using in Georgian political vocabulary revolutions, rebellions, etc., because it means beating the around the bush and sort of moving around the vicious circle. So that's one point. Another point that Georgian opposition does not have to be shy of saying that, yeah, we also in favor of protecting vigorously the national interests, sovereignty, identity. Actually, which Magyar has also used there skillfully. It depends how you frame it, depends who says it. So that is also very important. So we don't have to invent bicycle because there are some basic, we're all humans by the end of the day. So when people are listening to us that we're not sort of cosmopolitans and we in the first place pursue our own interests, that's very basic, that's very natural. So that is a second point, and I think Magyar has harnessed those skills very, very capably. Next point, which also comes to my mind, very streamlined party communication strategies, which he has done, and that's another challenge for the Georgian opposition. Although with Magyar, it was also quite peculiar because that communications strategy, as it seemed to me, was very much focused, heavily centered on his personality. But that was part of the tactics anyway. That it's a part of the strategy communication because again, it was Georgian opposition parties. You see, different leaders belong to the same party, speaking in different voices, and even sometimes different personalities, different mindsets, different backgrounds, and that does not resonate well with the voters. So that is another part, and also among few other lessons, which probably I would not be able to itemize, that differently from Georgia, when we're so much looking to not just new opposition parties, but new political signature, new signature style. You don't have to compromise with traditional cliches. And if you have to bid a farewell to traditional opposition, which is so much into the hands of the governing party, because they're the gatekeepers for newcomers. And once a newcomer becomes the affluent, or more or less reaches the verge to be powerful, then the ruling party and those gatekeepers, they unite against you. And that is also the reality which you have to face very boldly. And for pleasing, for winning hearts and minds of some of the traditional voters or status quo voters, if you have to say goodbye to traditional opposition and to depart from some type of archaic alliances, you have to do that. And Magyar did that when he said that, look, I would be starting from the scratch. And so those innovative approaches or innovative skills are very much required on our side if we if we really want to accomplish tangible results, and not just playing on the margins, just for the sake of being on the margins. Sometimes it looks to me that for many traditional Georgian oppositions, being number two is the most comfortable position, because you're visible, you're tangible, at the same time you're escaping, that very big chunk of the responsibility. So it's quite comfortable. So anyways, again, Victor, a few lessons which I could name from my side, running an analogy with the existing Georgian opposition landscape. Thank you.
Armen, I'd like to come back to you and kind of highlight the 2018 revolution and its role in not just changing the government of Armenia, but I'm curious, do you think it generally had a cultural transformation in the way that people think about government? And are we now seeing that kind of mental transformation actually take hold? Do you think that was a genuine a change in how people view politics? And how do you read the developments from 2018 to now? And as somebody that does advocacy, civic engagement, democratic development on the ground in Armenia, what are you seeing? What kind of feedback are you seeing? What are you observing in everyday people and how they view their politics?
Yeah, I guess in many respects, Armenia's story rhymes across what we've been discussing, right? In Hungary and in some respect, Georgia as well. The 2018 revolution was a result, at least it's widely considered, when the former president, during his tenure, the constitution was changed to flip Armenia from a semi-presidential system to a parliamentary system. And while we had presidential term limits previously, now in a parliamentary system, there would no longer be any term limits for a prime ministership, for example, right? As the chief executive, as the chief commander of the armed forces, et cetera, et cetera. And so while the president then had promised not to run for a third term, he essentially ran for prime ministership. And that sort of seems like that's where the civil contract in many respects was broken. And people, kind of got on the street. And then opposition member, currently Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, also similarly did a walk from the second largest city of Armenia, Gyumri, to the capital city. So there was this march similar to what seems like, during the campaign trail happened in Hungary to the border. And so he was able to sort of galvanize mass population and bring about the peaceful revolution, which is something to be, of course, celebrated, because there were no casualties, no violence, things of the sort. And at the time, there was really a renaissance, I would say, in Armenia, because people had this Homo Sovieticus mindset of we cannot do anything, everything is decided for us, our vote doesn't matter. In many respects, previous elections were always contested by the opposition, right? And suddenly people find them protesting and going to the streets, and then in follow-on elections, bringing to power the existing government, they suddenly felt that civic duty and civic responsibility does translate into actionable change on the ground. That, to a little extent or big extent, was crushed after the war, because that overall civic again, renaissance and people just being uplifted around the process was definitely beaten down by just the devastating consequences of the war and COVID and persistent skirmishes up until again recently, before the peace treaty was initialed. But nevertheless, on the local level, there's been a lot of good reforms in Armenia as well in the municipal elections, where people and the government are experimenting with participatory budgeting, where citizens get to have a greater vote in what projects get implemented on the ground. And municipal politics in Armenia is a lot more diverse and a lot more dynamic and interesting than the national politics, because you have other parties who are in governing coalitions or opposition than in the parliament of the country. So in many respects, I think sometimes when trying to look for, points of hope, instead of looking at the national politics, I personally like to look at the local level, and sort of that grassroots idea that Victor also mentioned, sort of doing this bottom-up perhaps that's the way to go, because a lot of people argue this change in Armenia to a parliamentary system was very premature. We still, I would argue, don't have very well developed political parties with very set political ideologies in the Western sense of the word, and voters don't necessarily coalesce around those ideologies, but rather the individual personalities and leaders involved in these parties. And so you have huge swings because people, are not subscribing to, I don't know, being a social democrat or a conservative, Christian conservative or whatever, but rather they like this person or they don't. And so this municipal level politics and consolidating that and bringing more opportunities for people to engage in everyday politics may be the ultimate solution in many ways, the more sustainable solution in making democracy institutionalized and sustainable in this country, and that translating more obviously also onto the national scale.
Thank you very much, Armen. And I know there's reasons for hope, but also it's good to be cautious and understand that there are risks with everything. Some experts say that the right-wing populism that we see in Europe or the US is not necessarily an endpoint, but actually could be a prelude for more disciplined authoritarianism to come on top of the democratic dismantling that we have seen in a lot of countries. So without undermining the historic nature of Magyar's victory, Julius, I'm curious, what are his biggest obstacles ahead right now? And do you think there is a chance that Magyar doesn't really end up repairing what Orban broke, and he could end up being another opportunistic leader that exploits systemic weaknesses? And also, how do you think EU can keep Magyar accountable?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Magyar was not very popular in Hungary. So Victor mentioned this idea of sort of finding a figurehead that everybody aspires to follow. It wasn't like that at all in Hungary's case. What happened was that they just wanted Orban out. So I know many people who voted for Tisza, which is Magyar's party, and not one of them liked him. Some of them were neutral, and quite a lot of them said, well, let's see how he works out. But none of them looked at him and said, he's the guy I want. They really wanted the old guys out. The second thing to note here, and this goes to the relations with and by the way, now he's got a much more positive, he's doing much better in the opinion polls than he has at any time previously, including during the election. And that's because he's making the right noises. He's talking about institution building. He's talking about democracy. He doesn't appear to be reverting to the kind of, I'm the boss now, I'm going to do things my way. He appears to be much more pro-European and institutional based in his kind of outlook. Now, what's going to happen next? The Hungarians do want a little bit of blood. That doesn't mean that they want people hanging from lampposts. No, they don't want that. But they want people to be charged. They want them to lose their money and perhaps go to prison. There's a new opinion poll out which says something like 65% of Hungarians think that Viktor Orban is criminally responsible for what happened, which is a very short distance away from saying he should go on trial. The others think that he was just doing his sort of political job and whatever happened, happened. So there's going to be a temptation for Magyar to cut corners in order to give the voters what they want. And then we come up against this age-old problem, should we be following process or should we be doing what is expedient and perhaps make sense in the short term? So that's going to be, one of his biggest challenges. The other really big challenge is that Magyar did not pretend to be a conservative. He is a conservative. Everything we know about him says he's a conservative. He's fairly religious. He's very patriotic, maybe borderline nationalist, depending on how you define it. And one of you guys talked earlier about, I think it was Victor talked about, you don't have to be anti-patriotic to be a successful opposition leader, and Magyar is definitely not that. So I think what people are looking for in Magyar is patriotism, pride that you can be a Hungarian and not feel like a second-class citizen in the EU, but also without the bitterness and the opposition and the sort of constant anti-EU enemy creating kind of psychology. One thing that is interesting is when you had the US was basically against the was pro-Orban. Russia was very much pro-Orban, and China was in a calibrated way fairly pro-Orban, and yet he lost the election. So what happens internally within a country is, I think it proves that it's very, very important. These small countries are not just sort of geopolitical pawns. Just to touch on that last point, what's going to happen next? Moderator's got lots of geopolitical problems. He's got lots of foreign policy problems. He's got a problem in his relationship with the EU. They are going to try and pull Hungary to the center of EU social values, and that's not where most Hungarians sit. Hungarians are far more conservative than the EU average, and they're not going to want their leader to represent what are considered to be normal social values in Brussels and what are simply not in Hungary. But the biggest problem he's got is the economy. And, the EU have, depending on how you count it and whether you look at loans or grants, have something between about 10 billion and 35 billion euros that could go to Hungary under various streams and for various projects. Moderator needs that money, and he needs it really, really badly. And even if he gets all of that money, he's still going to have a lot of economic problems. Without the money, it's going to be that much more difficult. So on the one side, he's got to sort of stick up for Hungary, fight his corner, retain his legitimacy amongst Hungarian conservatives who voted for him. The Liberals will continue to support him for the time being, although eventually that will also probably splinter. But on the other side, he's got to be emollient and skillful enough in his negotiations with the EU that he gets their, he gets their fulsome support and he gets a chunk of that money. So it's going to be a difficult thing to balance. We've already seen the first tiny little ripple. He appointed a justice minister who was his brother-in-law, and people were like, hang on a minute, that's not the way democracy works. So yesterday, the brother-in-law stepped back and he said, okay, you're right, I shouldn't be doing this. And he's just appointed another justice minister. But I have to say, apart from that, so far, all the noises that he's making, all the moves that he's making seem to be the right ones. We'll have to wait and see.
Victor, I want to come back to you. This whole panel has been about overcoming the sort of inertia of learned patterns. Obviously, there's much more hope in Hungary than in Armenia than there is in Georgia right now. But I'm going to get your take on how you see things unfolding in Georgia, and when the time comes that this inertia is overcome and this government is replaced and Georgia returns to its right path. Do you see this region becoming kind of a laboratory for democratic practices, future governance? What's your take? What is your forecast and vision for where Georgia can go after this?
Well, there's a one single case of benign of the trap to be benign. It's for Georgia to be trapped by those geopolitical developments that are happening in the region. So I very much hope what's happening around us. Although, we also have to be very honest. Once the West engages itself more deeply with Armenia and Azerbaijan, more Russia is doubling down on Georgia, and that goes in sort of with some proportionality in that respect. That's one point. The second point that Georgia has always been enjoying some geopolitical advantage by default, and that has gone now. That has gone thanks to the process which goes between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I mean, and I think that's good for us, because it makes us to think more about our competitiveness and to catch up with the process. So, and it's also important to say that it's so much important for all of us, for Georgia, Azerbaijan, to see this the things through the lens of the positive sum game. Because again, when I'm asked, how much we're losing, it's we're not losing, we're gaining. We're gaining because we're getting that incentive to boost up our competitiveness, to integrate ourselves. Although I should also say that the developments in the region are happening much faster. The Georgians, the politics are catching up. But anyway, so that's a long story. In any case, what we're witnessing, hopefully, fingers crossed, that forming up South Caucasian geostrata. And I hope I'm not exaggerating that because that is, but so you know, there's some conditions or preconditions, probably perhaps to form up a common economic space, common economic market. And of course, you know, the various initiatives which I've been discussing from a Georgian side, free trade economic zone or free economic spaces or corporate citizenship, different other mechanics to facilitate free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. And that is also very important for us to get a sense that thankfully we're getting away from the labeling, typically labeling the South Caucasus as a patch of land with civil strifes, conflicts, etc., moving into different directions. So this is historical momentum. This historical momentum and the windows of opportunity do not open very frequently and very regularly. And thanks to also to the leaders in different countries. So, and again, not to meddle too much with our internal cuisine, I hope that political leadership and that political stewardship would be very much appropriate to the developments in the region. And who knows, perhaps in 10, 15 years to come, we would be facing a qualitatively new community, political and economical in South Caucasus. So again, you know, as it goes, as the saying goes, you know, any crisis is a good condition for opportunities. So let's, at least we from Georgian side should very much cling to that saying, and hopefully that saying would crystallize on our case as well.
I know we're about 20 minutes over our time, so I just want to open the floor for any final thoughts that gentlemen have. 30 seconds to 1 minute. Armen, is there anything you'd like to close the panel with?
One thing I was in Brussels and The Hague last year, this time testifying in front of the Dutch Parliament and other stakeholders. And my point, one of my main points was there may be a Western future for Georgia without Armenia, but I'm not sure there's a Western future for Armenia without Georgia. Just taking into account pure geography. So, I mean, one thing we have admired, or I have admired personally from Yerevan, is still the resilience of the civil society in Georgia, protesting day after day, month after month, all this time just to try to claim their, civic rights and duties and, kind of keep the westward trajectory and future for the country has been nothing short of, admiration. And so I'm just hoping and sort of seconding what Victor was saying just earlier, that, hoping that in 10, 15 years, we look at the qualitatively different South Caucasus, because we refer to it as a region, but it's one of the most disjointed parts of the world in every sense of the word, like closed borders, different political, economic allegiances and alliances. But there is the momentum, there is the hope, and let's just, pray and work hard to make sure that we break away from the inertia of the past and look at the brighter, more creative, more energetic and brighter future for this part of the world. And by default, also the wider region, because as we see, this region also is the one looking ahead, connecting Central Asia and East Asia to Eastern, Central and Western Europe. So I think the strategic significance is only going to grow, and we have our work cut out for ourselves moving forward. Thanks again for having me. Madloba Didi.
Thank you, Armen. And yeah, the connectivity middle corridor aspect we haven't even touched on. That's a whole topic for a whole separate discussion. But thank you. I echo your sentiments. Julius, is there anything you'd like to add to what Armen just said?
I'd just like to reiterate your thing about agency. People do have agency. It's obviously limited when you're a small country surrounded by big countries. Geopolitics do matter. And, when agency and I mean, timing also produces agency, right? There's moments in history when you get to make big changes, and there's other times when you're just swimming against the tide. And for the last decade in Hungary, everyone's just been saying it will never change. It will never change. But of course, things do change. I think we're seeing Russia bleeding itself dry in Ukraine, and that is going to inevitably produce some kind of big change in Russia at some point. I don't know exactly what that change will be. And I think that change is coming, therefore. I can't say at this point it's going to be positive change. We'll have to wait and see. But the existing structures don't look tenable in even the medium term, never mind the long term. So for countries like, Georgia and Armenia and Hungary and Slovakia, and countries that are in the middle, smaller countries that are in the middle between big powers, that change will produce, there'll be dangers, but there'll also be opportunities, and we just have to be ready for them when they come.
Thank you very much. I guess as the chairman of Geocase, and this is the Geocase Forum, maybe I'll leave the final words to Victor before we close things out. And anything you'd like to add?
Well, thank you very much for the very candid conversation which we had. That's something which I hadn't necessarily pointed out, so that we really have had no restraints on expressing our views, so at least, on my side. So to sum up, again, a few not lessons, but reminders. Less pathetics. Let us stop sentimentalizing, romanticizing the politics, or personifying them. More discipline, more routine daily basis. And if there is one single instance or exception for revolution to happen, it's for our mental revolution. It's very timely and it's overdue. So if that would be feasible, that we would be more in a position to accomplish tangible results. So that's my appeal to my compatriots in the first place, of course, and to all of us. Thank you.
Fantastic. A great thing to close on. Thank you, Julius. Thank you, Armen. Thank you, Victor. I'm glad and I was honored that you participated in this very first episode of this series. And I hope to see you all again very soon.